Hello, and welcome to this talk that seeks to address the question as to whether autoimmune hair loss could be considered a disability in the UK. My name is Pete, and I am an independent academic researcher and also have a personal interest in this topic as somebody who suffers from Alopecia Universalis. The focus will be on the UK Equality Act 2010, but much of the information contained within the talk might well be interesting for people elsewhere or for other reasons. The talk will focus on the condition Alopecia Areata and its derivative diagnoses, Alopecia Totalis, Alopecia Ophiasis, and Alopecia Universalis. The key question addressed will be whether autoimmune hair loss can be considered a psychosocial disability as a result of the discrimination and prejudice that arises due to the condition. Some of the material covered here will be highly pertinent to the topic of Lookism. There is no suggestion that the physical aspects of the condition cause disability directly. This is an evidence-based opinion and should not be taken as medical or legal advice. The sources used as evidence for the basis of each slide will be referenced via numbers in the bottom right corner. The full list of references will be made available at the end. Key points: more severe and long-lasting autoimmune hair loss should be considered a psychosocial disability per the Equality Act 2010. This talk is not an attempt to label. If you do not find your condition disabling, no problem. One of the fundamental goals of framing autoimmune hair loss as a disability is to cultivate understanding and to help challenge bias and prejudice. Notably, the disabling factor of the condition is sociological. The impact is mostly psychological, but the cause of the disease is physiological. The talk is divided into 11 sections. Section 1 will seek to address briefly what alopecia areata actually is. Section 2 will cover some of the different types, severity, and prevalence of alopecia areata. Section 3 will discuss the importance of hair in socio-cultural terms and how hair loss has been associated with dehumanization. Section 4 will seek to address what a disability is, specifically in the context of psychosocial disability. With this groundwork in place, Section 5 will seek to address the disabling factors of autoimmune hair loss. Section 6 contains an emphasis on the physiological aspects of the condition and challenges the common presumption that the cause of the disease is psychological stress, highlighting how such a presumption may well be unhelpful. Section 7 will highlight some of the additional physiological issues that can be associated with autoimmune hair loss. In Section 8, the topic of treatment will be covered. This will be followed in Section 9 by a summary of the talk so far. In Section 10, I will discuss my personal experience of the condition and also discuss a newspaper article published in 2021 that was specifically focused on the prejudice associated with autoimmune hair loss. The final section, 11, will contain the references used as the evidence base for this talk. 1. What is autoimmune hair loss? Essentially, autoimmune hair loss or autoimmune alopecia is a condition where a dysfunction of the immune system causes hair to fall out and prevents hair from growing back. The primary reason for this condition is a loss of immune privilege in the hair follicle, which permits antibodies to target hair proteins for attack by the immune system. The reason for this loss of immune privilege is not well understood, partly due to the extremely complex nature of the human immune system. However, autoimmune alopecia does appear to have an external or environmental trigger, which could either be acute, that is, a sudden and significant event, or chronic, which means as the result of cumulative or persistent effects over a longer period of time. Here you can see a diagram of the hair coming from the hair bulb through the hair shaft and out of the skin. At the base, around the hair bulb, is the prime site where the immune system attacks the hair. You can see how many elements are involved. At the bottom, you can see a list of some of the different factors that normally are involved in maintaining immune privilege. This is not an exhaustive list, but it does go to illustrate how complex the system is. I will now move on to discuss some of the types, severity, and prevalence of alopecia areata. It is worth briefly explaining the different names used to refer to the different types of condition. Alopecia areata literally means bald patches or patchy baldness. Alopecia totalis means totally bald on the head. Alopecia universalis means totally bald everywhere. Alopecia Ophiasis means a snake-like baldness or going bald in a wavy line. There is also a condition known as diffuse alopecia, which is a general thinning of the hair. This is often not related to alopecia areata, but it can be a precursor to developing it. One of the issues with these terms is that many people do not know what alopecia means. Literal translations of the terms are medically meaningless. So explaining to somebody that you have alopecia doesn't tell them very much about what you are talking about, other than the fact you are telling them that you have some baldness. In fact, the word alopecia does not necessarily indicate an autoimmune condition. Common male pattern baldness is known as androgenetic alopecia, and so simply using the term alopecia may be confusing to the layman. It may be helpful to refer to the condition more specifically as autoimmune hair loss or autoimmune alopecia, and by doing so differentiating it as a physical disease that is different from other kinds of baldness. In terms of prevalence of the condition, there are significant differences between the different categories of autoimmune hair loss. Alopecia areata is commonly understood to affect around 1 in 50 people. Alopecia totalis, around 1 in 1,250 people. Alopecia universalis, around 1 in 3,333 people. And alopecia ophiasis, around 1 in 5,000 people. However, the estimates of prevalence can vary wildly. For example, two estimates in the United States have placed the number of people within the population suffering from alopecia areata at any given time as 5.3 million and up to 14.5 million, which is almost 3 times as many. I will discuss prevalence in a little more detail in the next slide. Presence of the disease within the family may indicate a higher chance of developing the condition. However, it is important to note that the vast majority of people who develop the condition do not report any prior family history. There does appear to be a significantly higher prevalence of the disease in urban and deprived populations. For clarity, prevalence means all cases within a population at a specified time. This can be contrasted with another term that is sometimes used in medical literature, which is incidence, and that means new cases in a population at a specific time. Therefore, it follows that prevalence will generally always be higher than incidence. Here we can see a chart that shows the percentage prevalence of alopecia areata by region. The region indicates the area in which the studies were conducted. It is not specifically related to the genetic background of the participants. However, genetics may well be relevant to the results. The percentage prevalence indicates the percentage of the overall population who are estimated to be suffering from the disease at any one time. We can see here that there are considerable differences in the estimated prevalence between each region. Some of the difference may be explained by differences in methods used in the studies within those regions. However, this is unlikely to account for all of the difference. We can see, for example, between Europe and South America, there is an enormous difference in the prevalence within the population. The area with the lowest prevalence is Europe, which geographically includes the UK. We can see here that even the difference with the United States is quite a marked difference, with perhaps 5 or 6 times lower prevalence in the UK than one would expect to find in the United States. And this may well be relevant when considering the approximate prevalence ratios described on the previous slide. For example, if alopecia areata is prevalent to the degree of approximately 1 in 50 people in the United States, it is likely to only affect around 1 in 250 or 300 people in the UK. The issue of prevalence is pertinent to the issue of discrimination and prejudice, because the more prevalent a disease is, the more likely any person within a given population is to have either experienced it themselves or to know somebody personally who has. There may, therefore, be a higher tendency for such a population to understand and accept people who have such a condition without making inappropriate judgments about them. By contrast, in a population with a lower prevalence, people may be less aware of a condition and therefore more predisposed to jumping to the wrong conclusion about the reason for a person's appearance. This ignorance can lead to prejudice, discrimination, and stigmatisation. The same systematic review and meta-analysis that was used to compile the figures used on the previous slide has also shown that there has been a dramatic increase in the diagnosis of alopecia areata over time. We can see that the pre-2000 level has increased fourfold post-2009. The reasons for this are not clear. However, they may be linked to the reasons for the dramatic increase in other conditions, especially the rise in autoimmune conditions and also other systemic diseases which can involve the immune system, such as cancer. Some of the reason for these increases may be due to an increase in diagnosis. However, the implication of the increasing toxicity of our environment, including biochemical pollution and electrosmog, should not be ignored. The prognosis for different types of autoimmune hair loss is pertinent to the question of disability. This will be explained a little more later. However, what we can see is that a large number, up to 50%, of alopecia areata patients do recover their hair within a year. Many of the remainder will recover after a longer time. Some go on to experience patchy baldness long term, but around 7% progress to more severe forms of autoimmune hair loss, such as alopecia totalis or alopecia universalis. Comparatively few of these patients will ever experience significant regrowth. Up to 20% of alopecia totalis and 15% of alopecia universalis patients have been reported to experience 90% or more regrowth after 10 years. While this figure is comparatively low, it may be higher than some people have previously assumed. There is even one case that has been reported where a lady recovered her hair after experiencing 35 years with alopecia universalis. Alopecia areata is often used as an umbrella term to include all of the associated types of autoimmune hair loss. However, researchers have identified that the use of alopecia areata as an umbrella term in diagnosis may fail to adequately differentiate between mild and short-lived conditions and the more severe long-term conditions. This can be problematic, especially when trying to conduct meta-analysis or systematic reviews. It's one of the reasons why we only have a figure for the increase in prevalence of alopecia areata over time and not of some of the more severe forms of the disease. Properly differentiating between the different forms of the disease may be highly relevant because there can be significant and measurable differences in the physiological behavior and biomarkers associated with those conditions, and in turn, that disease severity and those different physiological conditions may have implications in terms of long-term prognosis, the anticipated psychosocial effects, and decisions concerning treatment. For example, it may be appropriate to use higher doses or different kinds of treatments earlier on in an individual who has been identified as having biomarkers suggesting that they may progress to a more severe form of the disease when they are in the early stages. Next, I will talk about the importance of hair socially and culturally. But first, just briefly want to explain what hair actually is, physically speaking. Hair is a protein filament that emerges from follicles meaning little sacs, in the skin. These follicles are typically 3 to 4 millimeters deep from the skin's surface. The hair protein itself is mostly keratin. This is a tough protein, but also other constituents are included, such as water, lipids, pigment, and trace elements. All of visible hair is dead. It contains no living cells. In religious and cultural terms, hair or its absence is important. For example, most of us will have come across a person, or at least an image of a person, who is a Buddhist monk, and it is commonplace for Buddhist monks to remove their hair as a symbol of their commitment and devotion to the religion. However, it can also be understood as a symbol of castration because it is associated with chastity and as such is a departure from subservience to material and evolutionary drives and a commitment to a spiritual or transcendental path. In Judaism, there are some Hasidic females who remove their hair on marriage as a sign of commitment to that marriage. The Bible contains numerous hair removal rites. Sometimes it is described in association with mourning or loss. In Africa, the Ndebele also use hair removal as a sign of ritual mourning. A common factor between these practices is that they are a signal of a departure from what could be considered normal social standing, and often a signal of non-availability as a mate. That is, that the person with the hair removed is seen as somebody who is also removed, different, or set apart from normal society. The psychosocial importance of hair can be seen from its general relevance as an indication of status, class, religion, or culture across the globe. This may be in part because hair is an important mark of genetic viability, applicable to health, age, and vigour when seen in terms of the evolutionary mating drive. Research has shown that the subconscious trend for mate selection is for people to favour healthy, lustrous hair. Particularly in women, long hair is preferred, and for males, women find individuals with facial hair more attractive, despite often reporting otherwise. Culturally, hair removal has often been practiced as a deliberate means of dehumanization. For example, victims of crime sometimes have their hair removed, and prisoners of war or enemies of the state are often subject to having their hair removed as an indication that they are no longer an individual. They are either an outgroup or a subhuman. Now that we have little context of the social and cultural importance of hair, I will move on to describing what disability is. A broad definition is that a disability is a permanent injury, illness, or physical or mental condition that tends to restrict the way that someone can live their life. In legal terms, taken from the Equality Act 2010, a disability is any physical or mental impairment that has a substantial, long-term negative effect on normal daily activities. An impairment does not need to stop you or prevent you from doing something, but it must make it more difficult. For this impairment to be substantial, it should not be trivial or minor. This is open to interpretation and can be contextual. Long-term is defined specifically within the Equality Act as something lasting longer than 12 months. The idea of psychosocial disability is relatively recent. Some ways of articulating the idea may not be so helpful. Here is one taken from reimagine.today website. A psychosocial disability means that the way you think, feel, or interact with other people can form a barrier to fully participating in life. Now, we could turn this around and say a psychosocial disability means that the way other people think, feel, or interact with you can form a barrier to fully participating in life. Note how both definitions can be read with a very different emphasis on the locus of the issue. The first fully places the issue in the individual, and the second fully external to the individual. Neither of these are particularly helpful in defining psychosocial disability more generally. Perhaps a more comprehensive way of defining psychosocial disability could be social and psychological difficulties that occur in a complex interaction with the environment. Here we can see the definition does not identify a specific locus for the problem, and as such, it is more broadly applicable and more flexible. The issue of psychosocial disability is often connected with stigmatisation. This is a social phenomenon which involves a person being excluded from social acceptance due to a real or perceived characteristic, due to the stigmatisation associated with autoimmune hair loss. It has been described by researchers as a massive impairment to quality of life, and also psychosocially devastating. The effects of stigmatisation actually get worse the longer the condition persists, so it is a myth to think that a person with the condition is going to get used to it. The stigma associated with autoimmune hair loss has also been found to be worse than the stigma associated with mental health problems. Autoimmune hair loss patients often avoid public and social situations due to cruel and humiliating experiences. This in turn can have detrimental effects on their friendships and social life and increase isolation over time. These detrimental effects can be further confounded because friends, family, and work colleagues can often lack skills such as non-judgmental curiosity, compassion, and empathy, which are much needed in order to provide appropriate support and understanding. Additionally, poor experiences in social situations mean that social prescribing must be well considered. For example, sending someone into an environment where they may be further taunted or humiliated will not be useful. It is notable that depression and suicidality also correlate with the severity of the hair loss and the length of time it has been experienced for. This is highly relevant to the issue of psychosocial disability, as it indicates that the longer a person has suffered with a condition, and the more severe that condition is, the more disabling the experience is likely to be. So a person who initially may seem able to cope and function with their condition may later in life find that they are no longer able to do so. One of the key reasons for this is likely to be the cumulative effects of negative social experiences, and also due to the fact that as life progresses, many people will face further challenges that their condition makes more difficult, such as the need to find a new job, the need to find a new place to live, or the desire to find a new partner. And this brings us to the topic of lookism. Lookism can be described as prejudice and discrimination arising due to judgments being made based on a person's appearance. Evidence already shows that people's looks and appearance often give them a significant advantage or disadvantage, as opposed to their talent or ability. One study examining discrimination and people with autoimmune alopecia found that almost 1/3 of people think that people with autoimmune hair loss look unwell. 1 in 10 people think that they are contagious. 1 in 16 have reported that they would not employ people with autoimmune hair loss simply based on their looks. And endorsement of all items of stigma were found to increase with the degree of hair loss. That is, the more hair that was missing, the worse the stigma and discrimination was. The study that made these findings will be discussed a little further in section 10. Now, lookism is a controversial issue, and challenging lookism may result in significant and aggressive resistance. Part of the issue is the fact that appearance discrimination is an evolutionary trait, and it is neurologically hardwired. We all use appearance to make judgments to some degree. People who are dominated by their reptilian brain will place greater importance on appearance and be less open to challenge. When I refer to reptilian brain, I am referring to the triune brain model. I appreciate this model may not be as widely accepted as it once was, but I think for the purposes of this talk, if we think about the reptilian brain as being representative of part of our psychology that drives the most basic of instincts, such as the need to acquire food, the desire for physical safety, and the desire to mate. Because these drives are so strong, many people do invest a great deal of time and energy in their appearance, and many people gain significant advantage because of their appearance. So it becomes psychologically dissonant for those people to place importance on their own appearance, yet to claim that they do not do so with regards to other people. Appearance is also linked strongly with identity, worldview, and life purpose. It is intrinsically important to how they view themselves. So, if we are challenging somebody to not judge people by appearance, we may be challenging a lot more than we think we are. Indeed, this can activate subconscious processes in people, which will lead to a reaction of aggression or defensive resistance. It is important to acknowledge that lookism does exist. It is discrimination based on appearance, and it is deeply entrenched in human psychology and culture. This is unlikely to change significantly in the near future. Arguably, things like social media, video, TV, and advertising have made superficial appearance more important now than it has ever been. Whilst we may need to accept the existence of lookism and the fact that it won't be going anywhere, it is also important to accept that this discrimination can be disabling for some people. The Equality Act 2010 does describe severe disfigurement as a disability, and this is a recognition that social prejudice, i.e., lookism, can be disabling and is legally recognised as such. However, the term disfigurement is not precisely defined. It has been described by the charity Changing Faces as any condition, mark or scar that affects the appearance of a person's face, hands or body. Both Changing Faces and the charity Remploy consider hair loss to be a disfigurement. A disfigurement can be considered a permanent change in the appearance of a person's body that would generally be considered aesthetically undesirable. The term disfigurement does carry with it a judgment about desirability and about aesthetics that some would prefer to challenge. As such, the term visible difference is frequently preferred when describing somebody who may have an appearance that is different to what is generally considered normal or acceptable. However, in terms of the Equality Act itself, the word disfigurement is used, and this is why it is used in this talk. The Equality Act also makes clear that the disfigurement must be severe. That is to say, it is the cause of a significant impairment to daily life, either stopping you doing something or making it significantly more difficult. In terms of autoimmune hair loss, it could easily be argued that any kind of hair loss is a disfigurement of some sort, but to qualify as a severe disfigurement, it may be necessary that the hair loss is of the most severe type. Arguably, the loss of eyebrows and eyelashes do seem to be a severe disfigurement. Both eyebrows and eyelashes are conspicuously visible. They are hugely important for facial recognition, human expression, and non-verbal communication. And the loss of eyebrows and eyelashes is very difficult to conceal effectively, especially for men or people who engage in sports or active work. It is notable that the law does say there is no need for somebody who is considered to have a severe disfigurement to have to show the effect that their disfigurement has upon them. The effects of severe disfigurement have been researched, and there is evidence that people with visible differences do experience abuse, discrimination, and prejudice in almost all settings involved in daily life. This includes by NHS workers, in educational settings, by shop workers, in the job market, and when dating. Misattributed discrimination, that is, homophobia applied to people who are not homosexual, is also problematic for those who have suffered severe hair loss. However, there is a real lack of quality research that rarely addresses this issue, especially for men. Now that we have addressed some of the issues surrounding the disabling factors of autoimmune hair loss and how the condition can fit into the context of the Equality Act 2010 and qualify as a severe disfigurement in the most severe forms of hair loss, we will move on to discuss why autoimmune hair loss should be seen as a physical disease and why blaming stress could be wrong and unhelpful. The issue of the cause of the disease can confound discussions regarding disability. This is because the cause of the disease is physical. It affects the physical appearance, but the impacts of having the physical difference are overwhelmingly psychosocial. Research that was specifically aimed at addressing the association of stress and skin diseases, including autoimmune alopecia, has shown that the association is largely a myth. Studies that examine the issue have generally been poor quality, they lack control groups, and they fail to examine confounding factors. Consider this statistic from 2018. 74% of the general population reported that during the previous year they had felt so stressed that they were overwhelmed or unable to cope. Now compare this with the number of autoimmune hair loss patients who report a significant stressful event prior to onset. It is generally less than 25%. Even if it was exactly the same as the general population, you would expect around 3/4 of people to report a stressful event prior, and this would be normal within the general population. It does not prove any association. A further problem can be that medical professionals will often be suggestive of the fact that stress or mental health problems are a precursor to the hair loss, and this can instill the belief in the patient themselves that something that may have existed prior to the hair loss is relevant, when perhaps it might not be, it's just coincidental. It is not my intention to suggest that there can never be an association, or that in some cases it isn't a relevant factor, but merely to draw attention to the fact that the evidence does not support the association. And as such, making an association is actually compounding the stigmatisation experienced by people with the condition. It may also prevent medical professionals from making a full exploration of the causative factors, and thereby missing something relevant that, if addressed, may help alleviate the condition, or at least contribute to further research on environmental causes. One of the contentious issues with using the term stress is that it is so inexact, and for the physician and the patient, it is a rather useless term in actually identifying what needs to be addressed. It could be seen as a bit of a get-out clause for people who are reluctant to admit that they just do not know or do not understand what the cause actually is. Therefore, it may be useful to discourage the use of the word stress when referring to the condition. Research has shown that adverse childhood experiences do appear to be significantly higher for people who go on to develop autoimmune hair loss, especially events that were perceived to be life-threatening or involved emotional neglect or physical assault by parents and/or siblings. This is an example where being more specific and avoiding the use of the word stress may be helpful. We can describe adverse childhood experiences rather than just refer to stress. However, there are still issues even with this research. The first is that people who experience adverse childhood experiences are much more likely to be from deprived or disadvantaged families or communities, and therefore may experience more toxic environmental pollution, have less access to outdoor space, have poor diets, or have poor access to medical and dental treatment. And interestingly, the fact that the majority of autoimmune hair loss patients do not report such incidents suggests that it is not a key factor in causation. This may indeed indicate that some of the associated factors that go alongside adverse childhood experiences may actually be more relevant, such as toxic environmental pollution. So, perhaps the key issue with the term stress is that it does not really describe anything at all. It also increases stigmatisation, and the origins of making anecdotal associations between stress and hair loss increases stigmatisation. It may well be connected with the condition trichotillomania and crass clichés such as tearing my hair out. It may also be problematic because people who do develop autoimmune hair loss may go on to develop psychological issues as a result of the sociological reaction to their condition. This does not indicate a causative link between mental health conditions and hair loss. The psychological distress that arises afterwards should not be confused as a causative factor. Additionally, there is growing evidence that many psychological issues, such as anxiety and depression, actually have physiological causes. For example, autoimmune issues that affect neurological tissue and inflammatory conditions affecting the brain. In other words, mental health conditions themselves, such as depression, anxiety, and psychosis, are often symptoms of a physical disease and not a disease themselves. One factor that does appear to be a significant driver for autoimmune hair loss is oxidative stress. Toxins and pollution can damage human physiology and may be a trigger, for example, cadmium, lead, and mercury. The systemic effects of toxins and poisons can be experienced as stress, anxiety, or depression, especially when a person may not be aware that they have been poisoned. Interestingly, toxins are often excreted via the hair, and because the body can produce up to 400 meters in length of hair per month, it can be a very effective way for the body to get rid of toxic trace elements. Doing so may provoke an immune response that leads to a long-term dysfunction. Toxins can also damage gut biota and influence epigenetics, and such effects may persist despite the toxin itself no longer being present or detectable in the blood or the body. Blood tests can be problematic because the body will often remove toxins from the blood to stop it circulating. Toxins may then be deposited or stored in organs or fat tissue, but not be detectable in blood tests. Also, nutrient deficiencies may not be caused by inadequate intake, but due to malabsorption as a result of interference by toxins. For example, zinc can be displaced by phytates. Most people are aware that our environment and our food and our water is increasingly becoming toxified and polluted by man-made or man-produced chemicals and waste, and much of this may be implicated in systemic diseases that lead to autoimmunity and autoimmune hair loss. However, another problem with the modern world is the increase in electrosmog, and non-ionizing radiation may well be implicated as one of the many factors contributing to the rise in hair loss. Non-ionizing radiation has been proven to be a direct cause of oxidative imbalance. It may well affect the microbiome, including gut biota, which can affect nutrient absorption. It has been shown that it may contribute to leaky gut. Also, the effects of such radiation are not always direct. For example, Wi-Fi radiation has been shown to double the rate at which mercury will leach from dental amalgam. Overall, our radiation exposure has increased exponentially over the last few decades, and it continues to do so. In summary, this section was about emphasizing the fact that autoimmune hair loss is a physical disease with a physiological cause, and also to bring awareness to the fact that the use of stress can be stigmatizing and also distract from potentially identifying the true causes of the disease. If the true causes are not identified, no measures can be put in place to prevent or to help alleviate the disease. The fact that autoimmune hair loss is a physiological disease can be emphasized when we see the reported prevalence of associated physical conditions, which are often significantly higher than in the general population. Such conditions include lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, bradycardia, diseases of the retina, gut inflammation, microbiome imbalance, celiac disease, vitiligo, thyroid cancer, thyroid disease, anemia, atopy, metabolic syndrome, Helicobacter pylori infection, and vitamin D deficiency. The suffering caused by any of these conditions could also impact a person's mental health. So, it is important, if attributing mental health issues to autoimmune alopecia, that other conditions are also contemplated. This can help avoid making a false association and should also be considered before making a diagnosis of a mental health condition. For example, somebody who feels tired all the time may be suffering from a systematic physiological disease. It would be all too easy to make a diagnosis of a mental health condition and ignore the prospect of exploring physiological causes. So we have seen some of the potential causes for autoimmune hair loss: real, potential, and mythological. Now I wish to briefly mention some of the treatments available. This is important in the context of disability. If, for example, the condition can be treated successfully, this may alleviate the disability itself. However, even if a fully successful treatment was available, if it came with significant and disabling side effects, the condition could still be considered to be a disability. This is a moot point at the moment because there is no known and effectively reliable treatment. The fact that autoimmune alopecia can frequently resolve of its own accord can confound many studies or case reports of effective treatment. But some of the speculative options currently available include steroids, cyclosporin, minoxidil, antihistamines, cryotherapy, UV light, microneedling, lotions and potions including Ayurvedic mixes, immunosuppressants, anti-inflammatories, vitamins, especially vitamin D, fecal transplant, islet transfer, sulfur cream, pentoxifylline, and perhaps on the way in the not-so-distant future are JAK-ACE inhibitors or interleukin-17 inhibitors. If a successful treatment with only mild or minor side effects is identified in the future, then the disabling factor associated with the appearance-based discrimination that accompanies the disease may be alleviated. So, in summary, autoimmune hair loss is a physiological disease with no known cure. It can cause significant impairment to quality of life and daily activities as a result of psychosocial factors associated with bias, prejudice, and appearance-based discrimination. Where the condition causes severe disfigurement lasting longer than 12 months and particularly salient to the loss of eyebrows and eyelashes, it should be considered a disability under the Equality Act 2010. As per the Equality Act 2010, there should therefore be no requirement to prove the effects of the condition beyond proving its existence. This is not known to have been tested at law, but persons affected who experience discrimination and prejudicial treatment have a good legal basis for bringing cases of discrimination under the Equality Act 2010, including against employers or potential employers. It is notable that persons suffering with autoimmune alopecia are more likely than the general population to also have other physical conditions that influence their quality of life and affect their mental health. The cited evidence used in this presentation may be useful when claiming state benefits or to support the need for arguing for medical treatment or for reporting a hate crime. The Equality Act 2010 also covers incidences where service providers may treat you with prejudice or unfairly because of assumptions based on appearance. For example, being turned down for a dinner table at a restaurant, or having a rental application rejected. Additionally, if your condition qualifies as a disability under the Equality Act 2010 and you make a request for a reasonable adjustment in the workplace, or make a complaint about workplace bullying that results in further bullying or discrimination, you may well have grounds for claiming harassment. I hope this talk has helped bring attention to the need for broader campaigns to highlight the psychosocially disabling factors associated with autoimmune hair loss and the fact that this problem is located in society, not in the individual. In general, we have a need to address appearance discrimination in a way that is mindful of the potential backlash from those who are highly driven by very basic subconscious evolutionary drives that may be associated with the limbic and reptilian functions of the brain. Now I want to move on to discuss an article that appeared in the press in 2021 about autoimmune hair loss. The article appeared in the Mail Online, and the headline said, "Society stigmatizes hair loss, with bald people seen as less attractive, dirty, and less likely to get a job, study finds." Something I found notable about the article is that it described alopecia as an autoimmune disorder, where the body's immune system attacks the hair follicles, leading to hair loss. Unfortunately, it used the unspecific term alopecia, which simply means baldness. And as a statement, this statement is actually incorrect. Many types of alopecia, that is to say, baldness, are not caused by the immune system. Try to bear this issue in mind when we come to look at some of the comments made below the story a little later. Other key points made about this study were that almost 30% of people said that a person who was completely bald looked ill, and that was 27.6% more than for the same individual when they were depicted with hair. The results varied depending on sex and race. For example, a black woman was considered to have a medical condition by 1/3 of participants. However, this rose to 75.7% for a white man. That means, as a white man with no hair, 3/4 of the people you encounter will think that you look sick. Here you can see an example of the images used in the study, where the faces used remained the same, but the features such as the hair or the eyebrows and eyelashes were removed. If these images were not shown side by side, do you think you would know that the person on the far left was the same person on the far right? Here we can see some of the comments made below the article. Firstly, a shaved or bald head can be an attractive or unattractive aspect, depending society's culture and customs. Today, being bald is considered less attractive than a hairy head. Do we think that people like Jason Statham, Zidane, Kobe Bryant, Ed Harris, and many more are unattractive? Overall, it's a bit of a confusing comment, probably made by somebody who is a little confused, but it does acknowledge that not having hair can affect how people perceive you. One thing that it gets terribly wrong is mentioning a list of people who do not have autoimmune alopecia. They have androgenetic alopecia, which is very different. Another comment we see says, "Sinead O'Connor used to look great." Well, I agree, I think she did, but she didn't have autoimmune hair loss either. Here we have another comment. What about Bezos? No, he doesn't have autoimmune hair loss either. Another comment. I went bald mid-20s. It just means you were all man, full of man testosterone. Hair is for ladies. If I post a picture, will you all call me stunning, etc., just like they do on social media to give me a false sense of self? Again, this one is a little confusing. What the commenter does acknowledge is that hair is for ladies. What they seem to have failed to acknowledge is that the study the article in the newspaper was about also included ladies who suffered from hair loss. And another thing that they've missed is the fact that this is not androgenetic alopecia. This is an article about autoimmune alopecia, which is a different thing. Then we have another comment. Some of us don't waste hormones growing hair. Again, missing the point that this article was about an autoimmune condition. And this is important because A, the condition affects women, and B, the type of hair loss suffered is very different and looks very different and is judged very differently from androgenetic alopecia, which is normal male pattern balding. That is not meant to disregard the men who do find male pattern balding difficult to deal with, but it is very important to draw a distinction when discussing issues surrounding stigmatisation and prejudice. And the final comment on this slide is, I personally don't like bald. I don't like peanut butter either. Is that okay? Well, this is troubling for many reasons. First of all, clearly, if it's simply a personal preference, perhaps for dating, then no, that's not a problem. That's your preference. But making a comparison with peanut butter is very alarming. Peanut butter is a product you can buy from a shop. You can choose to buy it or you can leave it on the shelf. But peanut butter is not a sentient being. And the problem with I personally don't like bald is, to what extent do you not like bald? Would your personal preference mean that you don't offer a bald person a job? Does it mean that you will bully them in the workplace because you don't like how they look? Does it mean you would stigmatize and be aggressive towards them in the street? Does it mean you would like to round all the bald people up and kill them? Clearly, many of these things are not okay and have nothing to do with peanut butter or a preference for what you would like to spread on your sandwiches. Here are some more comments that appeared below the newspaper article. Most baldies look like either Martians or psychiatric escapees, and every bald-headed policeman I have ever met were all either aggressive or just plain bullies. So we may see here a person who has a hatred of bald people because they have been mistreated by some bald-headed policemen. However, the appearance discrimination is quite clear. Calling bald people Martians or psychiatric escapees shows the stigmatisation and the hostility toward people simply based on how they look. The next comment says, we have an inbuilt mechanism for detecting illness and avoiding it. It is to protect the survival of the species. This comment is basically true, and it is the case that autoimmune hair loss is a disease. So the person is acknowledging the fact that the survival drive will cause appearance discrimination for people suffering from autoimmune alopecia. However, what they may not be aware of is the fact that for most people who have autoimmune alopecia, it is simply a cosmetic disease. It does not mean a person will be less adapted to survive within their environment, which is effectively what the evolutionary drive is about. And it may well emerge in time that there is an adaptive advantage to hair loss in certain environmental conditions. So the superficiality of the judgment may actually be incorrect, even in these base terms. Additionally, of course, there is the question of whether we wish to be beholden to these basic biological drives, or if we consider the fact that being human endows us with a capacity to approach life and think about life in a different way. After all, our ability to take a deeper perspective and to be critically self-reflective are qualities that, as far as we know, set us apart from other animals. This is the basis of many of the things that enrich human life, including religion, art, music, and literature. Moving on to the next comment. All the drug addict shave their head. Well, here we have an acknowledgement that this person believes that anybody with a shaved head is likely to be a drug addict. This only adds to the argument that appearance-based discrimination is very real for people who suffer autoimmune hair loss. The next comment says, the weird one has no eyebrows. Eyebrows help when one goes bald. And here we have an acknowledgement of the severity of the condition that causes the loss of eyebrows. There is clearly an acknowledgement here that this loss is particularly distressing and more likely to result in discrimination based on appearance. The next comment says there is a hideous American congresswoman who is bald and paints on eyebrows. It wouldn't be so bad if she didn't have a big loud mouth too. That is the worst combo. Bald woman with a big mouth. Just awful. It's quite an achievement that this person has managed to get so much hatred and bile into such a small statement. We have misogyny and we have appearance-based discrimination. However, they have been combined. And what the person is saying, effectively, is that if the lady didn't have opinions and didn't express the opinions, presumably that the commenter disagrees with, he wouldn't hate her so much for being bald. So we can see how the stigmatisation of baldness can become a tool for an oppressor, where the person is unable to articulate a rational response or argument to what somebody is saying. They can use physical appearance as a means of aggression in order to oppress them instead. I understand the person this comment is about is probably Ayanna Pressley. I do not know much about her politics, but I do know she is an extremely brave and courageous lady. The final comment on this slide says, bald is one thing, when the eyebrows are missing is when you worry that person has cancer. That's what happened to my husband. So again, we can see here an acknowledgement that the loss of eyebrows makes the condition significantly more severe, in terms of assumptions people might make based on appearance. Moving on, we have some more comments here. The first one on this slide says, the pics were doctored, eyebrows lightened, and colour taken away from face, with the white dude missing his hair. This is observational and correct. What the person may be unaware of is that having autoimmune alopecia of the most severe kind means that you cannot grow facial hair, and this does affect the colouring of the face. People who grow facial hair, even those who shave, will have some darker colouring to their cheeks, their chin, and underneath the nose. However, somebody who has autoimmune alopecia will not have this colouring, and they will therefore appear slightly lighter in complexion. The next comment is quite revealing. This is a flawed study because the very first thing I thought of when looking at the photos the study used was cancer patients. Make it more realistic. The cognitive dissonance here is palpable. This person cannot even see their own prejudice in making the statement. The point of the study was to point out how people with autoimmune hair loss are judged to be sick, and that is exactly what the commenter has done. However, they are in denial of their own judgment, and rather than face up to their own internal prejudice, they want the study to be adjusted to fit their preconceptions about the world. Another comment here says, the non-bald propel, I believe that means people, had healthier looking complexions. The researchers also edited the facial features. For the study to be unbiased, only the hair should have been manipulated. Paler skin or a washed out complexion and hair loss will invoke thoughts of ill health. That's not a bias or stigma, and also how the questions were asked could play a role in perception. Well, the last point is true, but the rest resonates with one of the earlier comments. Here is another person who is in denial of their own prejudice. To associate thoughts of ill health with people because they have hair loss is a form of bias or stigma. It may not always be inaccurate, but the generalization is the basis of prejudice. The next comment says, I don't know why anybody would think they're dirty, but thinking they have a health issue is obviously accurate if the study is about alopecia. If you have alopecia, you visit a doctor. It is a health condition. Well, two things about this. Firstly, we have the framing of alopecia as a health condition, when all alopecia actually means is baldness. What we are discussing is autoimmune hair loss or alopecia areata. Then you would visit a doctor, and it is correct to call it a health condition. However, as mentioned earlier, for many people it is only cosmetic, it does not affect their health or vigour in any other way. And with regards to the perception of being dirty, dirtiness here is about the perceived phenomena that somebody may be contagious or somehow infected with something, and that you don't want to go near them because you may become infected by the same thing. So, for example, some people may make an assumption that a person has a bacterial infection, a virus, or possibly even some kind of parasite living on them. The last comment on this slide is a sobering one. I'm a balding woman who went bald from a hormonal condition. It would be fair to say that this destroyed my life. Thankfully, this person is drawing attention to how serious an issue it can be for people who suffer from hair loss, and a reminder of what the study and the article were trying to point out. The last two comments I wish to draw attention to may be the source of some amusement. The first one: if women have hair loss, even thinning, it is a tragedy. For men, it is a shrug of the shoulders. Women don't realise how tough it is for a man when they go bald. Another person here with cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, saying for men it's a shrug of the shoulders, and on the other, that women don't understand how tough it can be for a man when they go bald. At least they acknowledge for both men and women it can be difficult to lose your hair. Final comment, and possibly my favourite one: that's not bald, that's a solar panel for a sex machine. To finish the talk, I just wanted to share some of my own personal experience briefly. The first bald patches I developed were on my legs and in my beard, and that happened in 2005. At that point, I did not think I had a disease. In fact, I just ignored them. The first bald patch that I had on my head appeared in December 2006. At that point, I just decided to keep an eye on it, but I didn't know what it was. In January 2007, the first bald patch had grown and the second bald patch appeared. At this point, I went to my GP. My GP referred me to a dermatologist, and I first saw them in April 2007. But by that point, I'd lost around 50% of my head hair. I tried steroid creams, steroid injections, and cyclosporin, and then I ceased treatment in June 2007 because the cyclosporin was making me so sick. I simply decided I would have to live with the condition, and since then I have had no more medical involvement. By March 2008, I'd lost all of my head hair, and then, within a month or so of the last of my head hair disappearing, I lost my eyebrows, eyelashes, and body hair, and that was all in a very short space of time. In fact, one morning I woke up and had almost an entire eyebrow stuck to my pillow. Since then, I've had a couple of millimeters of fuzz grow on my head, but not my eyebrows, and that was in 2015, and it fell out again in the autumn of the same year. Occasionally, I do get a few bits of fuzz or the odd hair growing, generally mid to late summer, after a lot of time outdoors, but none of it ever grows into proper hair, and it doesn't last. The first time I experienced any prejudice was during the initial patchy stage of the disease. I was stood in a supermarket queue, and two women came into the queue behind me. One pointed out to the other that she thought I might have lice, and they moved to a different queue. They spoke very loudly. For a few years, I just had a few comments about being bald. I was called baldy. A few people stared, but there wasn't a huge amount remarkable. This changed in 2012, when I was spat at, called a queer, and had a lager can thrown at me in Manchester. My experience since then has continually got worse. In fact, it has become notably worse since the first lockdown in 2020. And it is now rare for me to go anywhere outside without something happening. Since 2012, I have been attacked in the street in London and called a freak. I've had a bottle thrown at me in Preston and called a faggot. Most abuse consists of being laughed at, but I have also been accused of faking cancer. I've been called a smackhead. I've been accused of being homeless. I've been called disgusting. I've been called a weirdo, a freak, a queer, a queen, a gay, a pervert, a pufter, and a pedo. The most vitriolic abuse is always misattributed homophobia, and this is often accompanied with threats of violence. It's fair to say that as soon as I developed autoimmune hair loss, I avoided certain social situations, but the frequency with which I have done so increased over time. And it has now got to the point where I don't go out very often. I'm certainly avoidant of particular places or particular places at particular times. Something that has started happening to me since the first lockdown is that when I am in traffic, I've had people roll down their windows and shout abuse at me, and even had people on the motorway who were overtaking decide to stop and stay alongside the car whilst they gesticulated and laughed. I believe there has been a tangible rise in the amount of aggression and hatred in the population within the UK over the last decade, and that the additional anxiety and fear caused by lockdown has created a situation where many people are venting their frustration and anxiety against anybody they come across that they can victimise. And just before I wrap things up with a list of references, I just wanted to try a little quiz. Here are 4 slides, each depicting a situation in which there is some office banter spoken. Which of the following examples do you think is acceptable and why? Example A. One of you needs to grow some hair. I can't tell the difference between you. Example B. One of you needs to lose some weight. I can't tell the difference between you. Example C. One of you needs to change colour. I can't tell the difference between you. Example D. One of you needs to grow taller. I can't tell the difference between you. An interesting discussion point might be which of those slides could invoke the Equality Act 2010 in an anti-discrimination complaint. And now I'm going to love you and leave you with the references that form the evidence base for this talk. Thank you for listening.